Good evening, everybody. Nice to see you all. In pre-COVID days, when we used to have functions, weddings, and bar mitzvahs, and all of that, there was a bar mitzvah function taking place. And there was that massive tray of sushi, where everybody would come on that big wooden board and pull a few sushi pieces out and put them on the tray. And then there was a big sign next to the tray of sushi that said, "Take only 3 sushi rolls. God is watching." On the other side of the table, there were piles and piles and piles of many little cheesecakes. And there, one of the Barmy boys' friends put up a sign on that side of the table that said, "Take as many of these as you want. God is watching the sushi." But the question is God even watching? Tonight, I'd like to dedicate the shir in loving memory of my dear grandfather, Menachem Mendel ben Ezra, whose yahrzeit was today. His neshama should have an aliyah, and please God, he should be a good advocate for all of Am Yisrael up on high. Also, in merit of a refuah shalema, a speedy recovery for Sarah Elisheva bat Rachel Gutta. Please God, she should come back home to her family, healthy, safely, and to be the mother she needs to be. On each of our Shalosh Regalim, on each of our holy festivals, we know that we read a Megillah that is associated and connected to that particular Chag. On Pesach, we read Shir HaShirim. On Sukkot, we read Kohelet. On Shavuot, just a week away, we read the book of Megillat Esther, Megillat Ruth, the book of Ruth. Now, this is a magnificent story of loyalty, of royalty, and of trust. I just want to give you a couple reasons why we read this Megillah, why it's so connected to Chag HaShavuot. So firstly, one of the names of Chag HaShavuot is Chag HaKatzir. It's the festival of harvest. It takes place during this time of year in Israel. It's the season of harvest. The story of Ruth, Megillat Ruth, the main part of the story, took place during the harvest season. And so it's fitting that we read it at this time of year on Chag HaKatzir, the festival of harvest. Another reason given is that we know that Ruth was an extraordinary woman. She was the great-grandmother of King David, of David HaMelech. David HaMelech's birthday and yahrzeit is on Shavuot. And so it's so fitting then that on such a day, when our greatest king was born and passed away, it's an incredible time to read about his lineage, about his origin, where he comes from. And so we read about his incredible great-grandmother, the story of Ruth. Another reason, the third and the last reason I'd like to discuss today, is we know that Ruth, she was a convert. She was a convert who embraced Judaism with every fiber of her being. She took on Judaism wholeheartedly. We too, each one of us, converted and convert to Judaism every single year on Shavuot. That original Shavuot, when our people stood around Mount Sinai and we received the Luchot from Hashem at the foot of Mount Sinai, at that point, when we accepted the Torah with the words Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and we will hear, we converted to Judaism. And so it's so relevant then that on this holiday, when we re-accept the Torah every single year on an annual basis, we re-accept Na'aseh v'nishma, God, we will do and we will hear. It's so fitting to read about a convert, about Ruth, who also accepted the Torah wholeheartedly and with every fiber of her being. I'd love to ask more of you to turn on your cameras. It's always great to talk to a crowd, to talk to people. So feel free, in bed, in pajamas. We'd love to see you all. There's a fascinating medrash that I'd love to discuss with you today on Megillat Ruth, on the story of Ruth. And bear with me for a moment while I explain this medrash to you, and then we'll go through it bit by bit together. The medrash goes like this. Rabbi Yitzchak says, when a person does a mitzvah, he should do it with all his heart, the Midrash goes on. Had Reuven known that the Torah would record the story, that Reuven heard that his brothers were plotting to kill his brother Joseph, and then he went and he saved Joseph from their hands, Reuven would have carried Yosef back home on his shoulders, back home to his father. The Midrash continues and says, had Aaron was Moshe's brother, had Aaron known that the Torah would write about him like this, the Torah would write, Hashem told Moshe, Aaron, your brother will see you, and he will be so joyous in his heart when he sees you, without any jealousy over Moshe's appointment as the leader of the nation of Israel. If Aaron would have known that Torah would record those words, the Midrash tells us, he would have come out to greet his brother Moshe with drums, with dancing, and with this outward element of joy. The Midrash continues with one more thing. Had Boaz in the story of Ruth, had Boaz known that the Torah would write about him, that he gave Ruth some parched grain, he would have fed her fattened calves. Now, this is a really, really strange Midrash when you look at it at first glance. It's referring to three famous biblical characters, where each one of these characters behaved in a great, noble, wonderful fashion. But the Midrash points out by each one of these personalities that had they known, each of them, that Torah would record their deed forever and ever and ever and ever, they would have behaved in a completely different way, in a totally different fashion. What does that mean? Let's go on. Let's dissect the story of Reuven and his brothers. We know that Yaakov Avinu, our forefather, Jacob, our forefather, had 12 sons. Child number 11 was Joseph. And Joseph's brothers despised him deeply. They hated him with heart and soul. And they wanted to kill him when he was alone with them in the wilderness away from their father. So comes Joseph on the command of his father, bringing food to his brothers. And his brothers decide at that point, what a perfect opportunity to kill our brother Joseph. We're alone in the wilderness here. Our father will never know. Reuven, the oldest of the brothers, turns to them and says, guys, I'm begging you, don't kill our brother Joseph. Don't take his blood, don't take his life, don't shed his blood. Please don't do this. Rather, he tells them, let's chuck him into a pit. Let's throw him into a pit, but don't, please, I'm begging you, do not lay a hand on this boy. Don't touch him. What Reuven was actually hoping was that the brothers would agree. They would throw him into this pit. They would then leave him over there. And when they'd be so preoccupied with something else, when their mind would be focused on doing something else, Reuven would then come back to the pit, rescue Joseph, and take him back home to safety to his father. But we know the story. It didn't go according to Reuven's plan. Reuven was away on an errand, and while he was away, Joseph was sold, taken down to Egypt, where he was actually sold as a slave. When Reuven, the oldest brother, returns from this errand and he finds the pit empty, he's horrified. He tears his clothing in mourning and he feels completely responsible for the loss of his brother. And it's right over here that the Midrash comments and tells us, had Reuven known that this story would be recorded in the Torah forever and ever, what would he have done? He would have right then and there picked up his brother Joseph, no matter what his brothers were saying and wanting to do to him. He would have picked him up on his shoulders and carried him back home to his father Yaakov and safely deposited his brother back at home. That's the first story. Story number 2. It's the story of our two famous brothers, Moshe and Aaron. When Hashem was encouraging and asking of Moshe to take on the leadership, go back to the land of Egypt. I want you to lead these people out of the land of Egypt. I want you to be their leader. We know that Moshe didn't accept this role wholeheartedly. It wasn't something that he wanted to take on. He was hesitant. He was reluctant to accept this position. One of the reasons is Moshe had an older brother. His older brother was Aaron. And he was so sensitive to the feelings of his brother. He said, what if my brother feels envious and jealous that I was chosen as leader of the people? I can't do this to my brother. I can't have my brother feeling this way because I've taken this role of leadership. And Hashem turns to Moshe and he assures him. He says, Moshe, I promise you, Aaron will come out and he will greet you with such joy. He'll be so happy that his younger brother is the leader of the Jewish people. He'll be so content. He'll be genuinely happy with the fact that you, his younger brother, was chosen by Hashem to be the leader of the Jewish people. Moshe, that is not a reason not to take on this role. Your brother will be happy and content for you. And it's right here that the Medrash tells us that had Aaron known, had he realized at this point in the story that Hashem was going to record this in the Torah, record what? He'll see you, Moshe, and he'll be joyous and content in his heart. The Medrash tells us that Aaron would have come out to greet Moshe with dancing, with drums, and with this whole hoo-ha that his younger brother was coming back to the land of Egypt as a leader of the Jewish people. And finally, the third story that the Medrash tells us is the famous story of Ruth and Boaz. The story of Ruth is just the most magnificent story. You can learn it and relearn it over and over again. It's got this simple beauty about it that simply never fades. It's the famous story of two women, an Israelite, a Jewish woman by the name of Naomi, and her Moabite daughter-in-law by the name of Ruth, and this incredibly human bond that they have between them. We know that Naomi lost her husband and her two sons in the land of Moab. So both these women now are childless widows. And Naomi decides to go back to her people, to the land of Israel. And Ruth is on her way. She's coming with her mother-in-law, Naomi. Naomi turns to Ruth and she says, Ruth, I beg you, let's go our separate ways. You go back to your life. You're a princess. You come from royalty. You're young. Go back home and start your life over again. I'm a poor woman. I have nothing to give you. I have nothing to offer you. Come on. Let's separate over here. Let's say goodbye to each other here. You go back to your life. I've got no hard feelings. And we know that Ruth was stubborn as anything at this point. And she says, no, your people are my people. Where you go, I'll go. Your God is my God. And she accompanies her mother-in-law, Naomi, back to the land of Israel. She converts and she joins our people. They both don't have a penny to their name. One day we know that Ruth went out to one of the fields nearby. She was searching for these leftover stalks of grain that halachically belonged to the poor people. And in this field, she meets this guy by the name of Boaz. Boaz generously gives her of his food, and he gives her some parched corn, some parched grain. She eats, and she feels satisfied. It's right here that the Medrash comes and tells us something regarding Boaz's behavior, Boaz's generosity. Had Boaz known at this point in the story that the Tanakh would record this story, that there would be a Megillah about the story, that he gave Ruth some grain, he would have prepared her an absolutely incredibly royal feast, a total banquet he would have given her. If Boaz knew that today in 2021 in our shuls, we would still be reading the story of Megillat Ruth, he would have given her more than a little bit of corn, more than a little bit of grain. Now we know how that story ended. Ruth lands up marrying Boaz. And 3 generations later, our greatest king, David HaMelech, is born. The Tanakh, the Torah, we don't have to go very far to see that the Torah is filled with so many personalities, with so many characters, people who did so much good. It's filled with people who lived and epitomized righteousness, goodness, holiness, spirituality. Why does the Midrash choose Dafka, these 3 people, to tell us that had these people known that their stories would be recorded for all of eternity, they would have done more? What is it about Reuven, Aaron, and Boaz? Why not any other one of the characters that we have in the entire, all the books of Tanakh? What is it about these 3 characters? And so Reb Moshe Alshich, who was this brilliant 15th century rabbi, commentator, and mystic from up north in Israel, the city of Tzfat, he explains something absolutely magnificent and completely magical, in fact. He says each of these three people, Reuven, Aaron, and Boaz, were unique. Why? Each of these three characters, they did something noble, something beautiful, something kind. But each one of these three was in fact afraid to go all the way. Each of these three people did the most incredibly kind acts, but was scared to finish it off and fully finish the act that they were doing. They felt it was too risky somehow, it was too worrying to go all the way. And so they stopped themselves midway. They stopped themselves short. Had each of these three known that Hashem would record their stories forever and ever and ever and ever, and today we would still be learning about these three characters, that knowledge, just knowing that, would have empowered them to take the risks, to not hold themselves back whatsoever, to not allow their fears, their insecurities, their worries and anxieties to totally take over and stop their actions halfway. What are we talking about? Well, let's go back into the three characters. Reuven was a conflicted man, ambivalent. His mind was conflicted in two places. On the one hand, he thought, maybe my brothers are right. Maybe Yosef, our brother, is a terrible person who is going to totally and utterly destroy our family in the future. Maybe you're right. Maybe they're right. He needs to be obliterated and annihilated right now before he does any more damage to our family. But deep down, when Reuven really thought about it, he knew they were wrong. He knew that that was impossible, but he lacked the courage. Reuven lacked the bravery to stand up to his brothers, to stand up for what he believed was absolutely right. You know why? He was scared. He was scared that his brothers would accuse him of being a coward. Reuven, you know that Yosef will destroy our family. You know that he's poisonous, that he's terrible, that he's treacherous for our family. But you're scared, you're a coward, because you are the firstborn. And if anything happens to our brother Yosef, you know that you will be blamed. Father will blame you for everything that goes wrong. So you are a coward. And so he was scared. He was literally, and he was afraid of being accused of being a coward by his brothers. So instead of standing up, instead of saving his brother Yosef, he did a half job. Instead of killing him directly, he had them throw him into the pit, which landed up, he was sold down to slavery in Egypt. That was where he was afraid, where he was insecure and didn't go the full way. Let's go to Aaron. Aaron was scared. He was afraid to display too much joy, too much happiness at his younger brother's appointment at being the leader of the Jewish people. He was worried that maybe in classic human nature, people would interpret his happiness and his joy as, that's not genuine. That is envy. That is absolute jealousy. He is portraying happiness on the outside, but in fact, Aaron is so jealous, he's so envious of his younger brother, younger brother Moshe. How is it actually possible for Aaron, the older brother, to be so happy for his younger brother Moshe? Surely he would want this position for himself. And so he was concerned and he was worried that the Jewish people would judge him and claim, why are you so joyful? Why are you so happy for your brother? Aha, you're just trying to get onto his good side as the leader of the Jewish people. You're trying to suck up to him. That's why you're so happy and joyful for him. So what did Aaron do? He completely contained his true and his real excitement and happiness for his brother, for his appointment as the leader of the Jewish people, for the Redeemer of the nation. He held that back in order to ensure that nobody would be able to claim that he is jealous instead of genuinely happy. And the third story is Boaz. Boaz also had his personal concerns, his personal worries. He thought to himself, if I give this poor young woman more food, what are people going to think? People are going to claim that I'm trying to seduce her. They're going to claim that I've got ulterior motives instead of pure motives of simply wanting to give tzedakah and help this poor woman who is new to this country, new to the nation. And so he decided to treat her like everybody else, to feed her modestly, not go the extra way, worrying what people around him would think and imagine that his motives were. So each of these three people, Reuven, Aaron, and Boaz, they all had great, amazing reasons, noble excuses for not going all the way. They were worried, they were fearful, what people around them would think and say. They were worried about their reputations, and they cut themselves short and they stopped halfway. They did beautiful things, but they held themselves back. They didn't allow themselves to go all the way because of this innate fear inside of them. And that innate fear brought about a missed opportunity. If only I would have done that. They were actually denying themselves, each of these three, they were denying themselves the opportunity of living proactively, of taking life into their own hands. But rather, they weren't able to do that because their fears took over, and they weren't able to take the reins of their own horse, be the captains of their own ships, and go forward with their lives. But had they known at that very point in history, in each of their lives, had they realized how God viewed them, had they realized how Hashem was looking down at them, how Hashem was writing and recording down every single one of their actions, every single one of their thoughts, that would have given them the courage, the passion, the willpower to ignore their worries, to give up on their anxieties and get the job done fully, despite what they were worried and fearful about. The question is, what about you and I today? What about you and us, you and me today? You see, in the days of old, in the days of the Tanakh, these people merited to be recorded, their stories recorded in the Torah, in the Tanakh. Hashem took note of each one of them throughout their lives, what they did, what they didn't do, and the Torah recorded each one of these actions. Till the end of days, till today, we're still reading these stories. But what about you and me? What about our lives? What about our actions? What about how we live our lives? Is anything happening with that? The Medrash continues, and the Medrash teaches us that everything you and I do is being recorded and written down as well. If you could pause for a second and really grasp this concept, really digest it, really take in the idea that everything we do and we say and we act and we think is being recorded, we wouldn't make the same mistake of past generations. In fact, we would go all the way, all the time. We would make ourselves vulnerable for doing the right thing. We would do everything we possibly can to stand up for justice. We would go that extra mile to avoid faribbles, to avoid conflicts. We would sleep an hour less at night to be engaged in something worthwhile. We would ensure that everything we're doing is being recorded, and so we've got to live every moment of our lives. But the problem is, we don't realize that every moment of our lives is being filmed. Every moment of our lives is being recorded. In fact, we underestimate our actions. We underestimate our gestures and our lives. We often dismiss those things that we value as being unimportant or perhaps not urgent for now. But right in the beginning of the Torah, in the book of Bereshis, the Torah tells us like this: Zeh Sefer Toldot HaAdam. This is the book of the story of man. Just like the stories of Adam, of Avram, of Yitzchak, of Yaakov, of Moshe, of Boaz, just like all of those stories were recorded and written down in this book, in the Torah, so too tells us the Torah, our lives today in 2021 are being recorded as well. We're each a critical chapter in this book, and everything we do or don't do matters significantly. We're in the middle of learning Pirkei Avot, Ethics of Our Fathers. And in Pirkei Avot, we learn, V'chol ma'asecha b'sefer nichtavim. All your deeds are recorded in a book. This wasn't written for the people of old. This wasn't written for our forefathers. Pirkei Avot was written for you and I. Can you hear me? Pre-Shavuos was written for you and I. It's a book. It tells us that everything we do is being recorded all of the time, and there's no getting out of it. There's no hiding. There's no running behind the bush. It's this realization that nothing goes unnoticed in our lives that would push us to go that extra mile and ensure that we never hold back, because nothing in our lives ever goes in vain. Nothing in our lives is ever forgotten. I'd love to share with you the following story I've recently come across. It was an absolutely boiling hot day, middle of June in Israel. You can picture that hot sun, that humidity. And there were two sisters who were walking up a hill. They were making their way to their brother's grave. Their brother, Daniel, was a soldier in the Israeli army, and he was killed in an ambush in Lebanon. And they were going up to pray by his kever, by his burial, by his grave. And there was a memorial that was being held to honor the memories of all those soldiers that had been killed in that particular ambush. And as these two sisters, arm in arm, are trudging up the hill, walking over to their brother's grave, they noticed this very elderly looking Jew, very, very old Jew. He was breathing heavily and trudging along step by step, totally sweating in this blistering, boiling summer Israel heat. And suddenly he trips over a stone and he falls to the ground. Quickly, they drop whatever they were holding. They ran over to this old man. They help lift him up, help him back on his feet. They call a nearby soldier that was standing there to come and help them. And as the soldier takes over, the two sisters leave and they carry on walking towards their brother's grave. They reach Daniel's grave. They pull out their Tehillim. They start saying words of Tehillim. And from the corner of their eye, they notice how this elderly gentleman is staring at them. Literally from another grave, he's just watching them and he can't get his eyes off them. So they thought, okay, he's very appreciative and grateful that we helped him up and that we, were there when he fell. But soon they noticed that this gaze that he wasn't letting go of them obviously meant something deeper. And as they were finished davening at the brother's grave, they started to head down and they met this elderly gentleman as they were coming down. He comes over to them and he says, "Who are you? And what are you doing at this particular soldier's grave?" And they said, "Well, we're his sisters." He's got this look of shock over his face. And he says, "That's impossible that you're his sisters. I know that Daniel was a lone soldier. He had no family members in Israel when he was killed. I remember it so clearly." And the two sisters respond that he's correct. When Daniel was killed in Lebanon, they weren't living in Israel, but soon after he was killed, they moved to Israel. And as the conversation moved on, the sisters turned to this elderly man and they said, "Who are you and how do you know Daniel?" And he explained to them that his son was Daniel's commanding officer in Lebanon. And he points to the grave where he was standing. And he said, "That's my son, Daniel's commander. That's his grave. He died a couple of months after Daniel." He started to cry uncontrollably. And he says like this, "When your brother Daniel was killed, my son, his commander, told me that Daniel didn't have a family member in the land of Israel. And every single year on his yahrzeit, my son made sure to come up to his grave for those 1 or 2 years, arrange a minyan, arrange 10 men, and say Kaddish at Daniel's grave. But ever since my son," says the old man, "was killed in battle, I have continued his tradition of coming up to Daniel's grave on his yahrzeit to say Kaddish. But I never knew that you guys existed. I never knew that Daniel had family." He was so exhausted at this point, he turned to the two sisters and he says to them like this, "I'm an old man and I feel that my time is close. I don't know how much longer I have over here. I don't even know if I'm going to be around next year on Daniel's yahrzeit. I ask you to please make me a promise. Promise me that you will ensure that every single year on Daniel's yahrzeit, your brother, Kaddish will be said for him right over here." Of course, they promised. And they carried on down the hill and they noticed from behind them that the elderly man continued up to Daniel's grave. He stood at Daniel's grave. They were listening to what he said. And he said, "Hashem, you know how faithful I've been to those that have passed away. Only you know how I've ensured that Kaddish is said by this grave every single year. But today I'm giving that responsibility over to his two sisters. They have promised me that Kaddish will be said every single year at Daniel's kever. And he leaves. The story goes that a couple of months later, this elderly man passed away. This story epitomizes our lives. Not only is it the love that exists between us or that needs to exist between us, but rather it's the idea that Daniel, this lone soldier, was not forgotten. He wasn't forgotten because he was remembered by his commanding officer and then by his commanding officer's father, who ensured that his sisters would never forget him either. But that is the story of you and I. This is our lives as well. Because in some place, in some world, in some book, every single life, every single person, every single action, everything, every single deed leaves a lasting impression. Nothing is forgotten. Whether we know about it or not, whether we realize it or not, our actions are constantly being recorded. Everything we say, in fact, is being recorded by our children. The amount of tzedakah, the amount of charity we give, or the excuses that we don't want to give, the comments that we mutter under our breath where we think that nobody else can hear, our moral behavior, our business ethics, what we eat, what we drink, what we watch on Netflix, the books that we read, the good deeds that we do, the mitzvahs that we celebrate, the shiurim that we tend, the Torah that we learn, how we talk on the phone, how we react in a traffic jam. All of these things and so much more are constantly being imprinted and engraved on someone around us. And they go way beyond those who directly hear them or who directly experience us doing them. So much of who we are, so much of what we do can be traced back earlier generations. We can trace it back to our parents, to our grandparents, to generations earlier. We're not just people who have arrived on this planet and forged our own lives. Each one of us is a product of all the people that have entered our lives and touched us. Parents, grandparents, siblings, teachers, friends, colleagues, community members, everybody around us. They help to make us. And then there are those that have bruised, betrayed, and hurt us. There are those that have lifted us and those that have strengthened us. Those that are a complete and utter burden on our lives, and those that are an unbelievable blessing in our lives. All of these people have a total impact on who we are today, on how we live our lives. And everything in our lives is recorded, remembered, and engraved. Chaim Nachman Bialik, who was a Russian Jewish poet from 1873 to 1934, he came to be recognized as Israel's national poet. In his poem, Shirati, he traces the origin of the sigh, the sob, the cry, which he so frequently talks about in his poetry. And in this poem, Shirati, he describes the tragedy of his childhood, how his father died when he was very young. His father left 7 young little orphans behind. His mother was forced to work in a little shop to support her children all day long, literally all day long. And only in the evening, she would come back home when she would cook and clean and sew and tend to her young children. Life wasn't easy at all. Well, late one night, little Bialik gets up from his bed. He comes to the kitchen, and there he sees his mother cooking. That was when she cooked, late at night in the kitchen. She was completely exhausted. The little boy could see how tired his mom was. And she was sobbing. She was crying her eyes out as she was kneading the dough and baking her bread. And he heard, as he was standing by the door where his mother couldn't see him, he heard his mother praying. And she was saying, "May I raise my children to be God-fearing. May they be true to Torah. May they never disgrace me." And there she is davening and praying while she's kneading and baking her bread. And as she davened, these tears are streaming and running down her beautiful cheeks. And without realizing it, little Bialik notices how his mother's tears directly go and they fall into the dough that she's so lovingly kneading. He watches his mother and he goes back to bed without his mom realizing that he was around. The next morning, he ate of this bread that his mother baked the night before. And he says like this, "As I ate, I swallowed my mother's tears. Part of my mom was in that bread. Now you know why there are tears in my eyes. I swallowed my mother's tears." Whether we like it or not, this is the reality of our lives. A portion of our parents, of our grandparents, of past generations is entrenched and engraved inside every single one of us. They have made permanent impressions on us, and this has been engraved. We eat their tears and their laughter. We drink their smiles and disappointments. We consume their joys and frustrations. Every part of us has got our parents and our grandparents inside of us, because past generations do not die out. They are alive and kicking in our hearts and souls. There's a certain phrase in the Torah that describes death. And the Torah often uses these words. And in fact, I teach these words, I teach this verse in Chumash to my grade 3 students. And every single year, there is one child in the classroom who raises her hand and says, "Mora, what does this mean?" And the verse goes like this. Vayigva, and he passed away. Vayayasef el amav, and he was gathered to his people. This is said regarding Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, David HaMelech, Shlomo HaMelech, King David, King Solomon, and many, many others, that they passed away and they were gathered to their people. What does it mean they were gathered to their people? What does that even mean? How do you get gathered to your people? And I've often struggled to answer my kids in class, and I finally now have a beautiful explanation to teach them and give them. When we die, we don't disappear. We're not just buried in the ground and life moves on. But what is it? We are gathered to our people. That's where we land up. We land up in people. People land up in people. People do not just land up under 6 feet under in the ground. And this is our reality. We're constantly making entries, minute after minute, day after day, week after week. And these entries are being imprinted and engraved on our loved ones, on fellow human beings, and on the general community around us. We're coming up to Shavuot. We're a couple of days away. And we know that Yom Tov is always a time when we reflect back onto generations that have preceded us. And as we turn back, and that's one of the reasons, by the way, why Yizkor is set on Yom Tov, because it's a chance to really reflect back on what was and where am I today. And so as Yom Tov approaches us, and we turn back and we reflect and we review what an impression the past has made on us, it's such a fitting and an opportune time to ask ourselves, what entries am I making? What actions of mine are being recorded? What are my children and my grandchildren going to remember? What are they seeing when I think they aren't looking? Am I going all the way? Am I living my life fully? Am I embracing every opportunity and situation that comes my way? Or am I holding back and holding on because I'm gripped with fear and anxiety, and I'm constantly making stories that support my fears, and I'm constantly making up excuses? Which one is it? The moment we realize that our lives are not in vain, the moment we realize that every one of our actions is recorded by Hashem, we begin to appreciate the magnitude of every one of our actions, of every one of our lives. And if every moment of our lives is being recorded not only by God, but on everybody around us, then shouldn't I take more risks and go that extra mile? There is a story told about a shul in London where there was an elderly man that davened over there. And this elderly man, every Shabbos, I guess you could call him the sweet man. He had this big bag of sweets, And all the children would line up throughout davening. I guess it was also pre-COVID days. They would line up in front of him to receive a candy, to receive a sweet, to receive some sort of, I don't know, a fizz or whatever it was that he was giving out. And as each child came to this elderly man, he wouldn't just give him and pass over the sweet, but rather he'd hug the child with heart and soul, ask the child how he's doing, give him the sweet, and move on to the next child. And this is actually what happened throughout the whole shul service. Kid after kid was coming, asking for a sweet, getting a hug, getting a how are you, what's going on, and moving on. There was a certain newcomer to the shul that noticed this ritual going on the whole shul service, went over to the elderly man at the end of the service and said, what's going on? Do you do this every week? Why, how, what? Tell me the history. This is the story that the elderly man shared. He said, I survived the war. I'm a Holocaust survivor, but I'm a lone survivor. I lost every member of my family, parents, siblings, uncles, aunts, grandparents, everyone. There is not a cousin around that belongs to my family. And I came out of the war realizing that my family had gone up in smoke in the crematoriums of Hitler Yamach Shema, and he was devastated beyond words. A lonely man in a scary, dark world all on his own. And like so many of the survivors, this elderly man said, I will never, ever, ever get married. I will never, ever bring children into this terrible, dark, and heartless world where these horrors can be experienced. I would never want to bring children and allow them to go through something that I have gone through. He was filled with so much pain, with so much grief, with so much hurt that he wasn't able to get married and have children. After a while, somebody suggested to him, why don't you go and pay a visit to the Lubavitcher Rebbe? The Rebbe who understands and speaks so beautifully to all of these survivors, who understands every single survivor story. Go have a chat to him. And we know that survivors in the 50s and 60s were literally pouring heart and soul out to the Rebbe. He agreed. He went to New York and he shared his story with the Rebbe and how I have no interest in rebuilding my life. That's it. I'm done. When I die, the line of my family dies with me. Too angry and too sad to move on. And the Rebbe turned to him with the most powerful, get goosebumps when I think about it. And the Rebbe said, what links you today to your family that was murdered so violently by the Germans? What is it that links you to your mother, to your father, to your grandparents, aunts, uncles, siblings, cousins? What is it that links you to your whole family that went up in smoke in the crematoriums? It can only be one thing: the connection you have to them, the love that you feel towards them. What is left of your connection to them is only the love that you have for them. They may be gone, but your love for them will never, ever disappear. That is your connection to them, the love that you have for them inside your heart. The Rebbe turns to him and says, if you want to stay deeply connected to all your loved ones that you lost in the Holocaust, it is only by keeping your love towards them alive and kicking and keeping your love growing. And you know how you do that, said the Rebbe? By bringing children into this world and giving these children of yours all the love that you possibly have in your heart. And the Rebbe continued, the more love you give to your children, the more you will experience that love inside of you, and the deeper your connection to your family that you lost, the deeper that connection will be. And so the Rebbe turned to him and said, you must marry. In fact, you don't have a choice. You have to marry. And you've got to give your family that you lost the only thing that you possibly can, which is the love you have towards them, and by having children. But don't stop over there. This love that you have, you've got to give it to all children that you encounter, not only your very own children. Give them all the love you possibly contain in your heart. And with that, you will hold on to the family that you lost. So this elderly man turned to the guy next to him in shul and he says, well, here I am. I'm a Zayda. I have children. I have grandchildren. And every single child that passes my seat in shul, every child that passes through my life, I will give them all the love that I have in my heart so that I can hold on to the love that I have for my mother, my father, my brothers and my sisters and everybody else. These children would never, ever know what this old man was going through. They would never know how much love this elderly man had in his heart. But he loved them, he loved his parents, and he lived his love by giving these children all his love. And by that, he remained connected to his loved ones that he lost in the Holocaust. Human life is just one long story. There is no such thing as an isolated human being. There is no such thing as a lone act or an insignificant word. As much as sometimes you want to run away to an island with absolutely no Wi-Fi or reception and just stay there for a while on our own and disconnect from the rest of the world, there is no such thing as a lone human being, because we are so deeply entrenched. The love, the passions, the emotions, the teachings of all previous generations are passed on to their children, to their communities, to everybody else around them. You and I are just another link in this massive chain called human life. We are connected to the story of Reuven and to his longing to save his brother Yosef, but yet this inner conflict that he had inside with him that he had to deal with. We can identify with Aaron, who was afraid of what people may say behind his back if he shows too much joy and too much happiness for his brother's appointments. And we are deeply connected to Boaz, who worried that he may give out the wrong motive for going beyond and helping Ruth a little bit extra than usual. But we have to learn from these powerful individuals. They were driven by goodness, by kindness, by purity, by righteousness. But their fears and anxieties took over at one point. They are written in the Torah and they are recorded so that you and I can learn from them, that we can connect to them and draw from their wisdom and live our lives fully and embrace every opportunity and situation that comes our way. As we are about to enter Chag HaShavuot, the time of the giving of our Torah, it's exactly 3,333 years ago. This Chag, this Yom Tov, this holiday is the foundation of Judaism. It's the foundation of the rest of the calendar. It's the foundation of who you and I are. And it's the perfect opportunity to reflect back on Ledor Vador, from generation to generation. We are a people that is built on the generations before us. We didn't just spring up a couple of 100 years ago. We've been around for thousands of years, and we are so connected to each generation that has passed for those thousands of years. We don't live our life in isolation. We are so deeply connected to our past, to each other, and to our future. And it's now coming up to Shavuot that it's the opportune time to reflect on what memories, what values am I engraving on the lives of my family, my friends, my children, my community? What legacy am I leaving for them? It's time to let go. It's time to let go of all those fears, of all those anxieties, of all those worries and stress that we have. It's time to step into the light and live life fully. Because had Reuven and Aaron and Boaz known that we would be reading their stories today, they would have gone all the way through, tells us the Midrash. And so we have to learn from them and give all the love you possibly have. Go all the way. Don't hold back. Because as the Rebbe told this elderly man, this Holocaust survivor, the more we give, the more we will receive, the more we will be connected to past generations, the more we will connect to future generations. The deeper our connection will be to each other. And please God, we should see no more tragedies. We should see no more devastations. Our people should come together. Am Yisrael should come together like we did 3,333 years ago at the foot of Mount Sinai. Ke'ish echad belev echad, like one man with one heart. We should be able to physically see that deep connection to our past, the connection to each other, and the connection to our future. And we should merit to live our lives fully and wholeheartedly with never holding back. Wishing you a good night.